We're here at the edge of the Salar, the salt desert, the Atacama desert, which is just behind us there. And we can actually see some mining companies in mining operations in the distance.
Yeah, that's right. So behind us, the biggest amount of, I guess, dust that you can see in the distance on the horizon is from the SQM, Soki Mitch they used to be called, but SQM lithium miners, who take out 12,000 tons of mineral from the Salar each 24 hours. And next to them, also behind us, is the smaller lithium mine. So both of those lithium mines operate on the Salar de Atacama, the Atacama salt pan, which is behind us.
So mining is a big issue, but behind us is also Peine, your main fieldwork site, a small town, also at the edge of the Salar. And the Salar has been a life-giving resource for them for a long period of time. And we've actually gone and visited one of the lagoons, one of the places where there's water in the salt desert.
So yesterday we visited the place where in the past they used to harvest salt, blocks of salt, to trade with their neighbours who are just over this way from where we're sitting here now, Hoffstaedter. So they would go down there in winter time, and we visited that place. And then today we visited another place in another part of the salt pan where there's a freshwater pool. And that freshwater pool was a place where they would take animals in wintertime. So it's a pasture, it's a meadow, and it's all overgrown now because not so many animals are taken there.
This being the most arid place in the world, water is always an issue. And we've got the mining companies, we've got places, oases that are being used by the local people here. Can you give us some context about the contestation over water as a resource for agriculture on the one hand and resource for mining on the other?
So people here use water that comes from particular springs. So Atacameños, people who are indigenous to this area, also referred to as Licanantai, they use water from springs, particular springs in this area, which feed the oases. So behind us is Peine, which has 3 springs that feed its agricultural fields. They also grow plants, mainly corn and alfalfa for animals in Tilomonte, 15 kilometers that way. And that is also is fed by a spring which is further up in the mountains here. Today we also went to a sector, an area called that the miners have renamed Negrillad, and in that area there's a field, they call it a field, a campo, of wells where 2 copper mining companies are extracting water, subterranean water. So you have 2 kinds of water in a sense here. You have water. It doesn't look like you have much water, but actually there are springs that feed the oases, the agricultural oases, and then there are these subterranean aquifers from which mining companies extract. So in the case of Mina Escondida, operated by BHP Billiton, one of the biggest copper mines in the world, which operates just a little way down the road here, they extract just over 1,000 litres a second from the aquifer that's in that portion. So that's registered water rights in Chile in the early 1980s. The Pinochet government introduced a law called the Código de Agua, the Water Code, in 1981, and that privatized all water rights. So that meant that, particularly for this region, particularly what you have in this region is mining, lots of mining wealth. and what the mining law and the water law enabled, that were put in place by Pinochet at that time. They enabled mining companies to register and own the rights to extract water at a certain amount. So that's what happens. It's the waters are owned privately, and they extract at a certain amount. They have registered rights to extract. Where we went today was you have two, in the whole field of wells, you have two different kinds of wells. You have wells that were registered, that had registered rights before the Indigenous law, recognising Indigenous rights to land and water, which was in 1993, and it was post-dictatorship. And you have wells that were registered after the Indigenous law. So people here in Pena, for example, have legal agreements that recognise legal agreements with one of the mining companies, Minut Escondida or BHP Billiton, which is Australian, mostly. They have recognized a legal contract with that company because that company has a certain number of wells that were sunk, and water rights that were registered after the Indigenous law that recognised territory and water. Saldiva, the other copper company, has a whole bunch of other wells that were there before the Indigenous law, and therefore they're not. There's no real compulsion for them to make a legal agreement with Indigenous people.
So the Indigenous law only changed things for new wells. There was no retroactive.
There's no retroactive recognition. That's changing a little bit now. So in 2000 they started talking about it in about 2007 here in Chile, and it was ratified in 2009. The Convention 169 of the International Labour Organization. So that recognises, that's an international covenant, and Chile ratifying that, signing that covenant, meant that they were then compelled by that international law to introduce laws, especially important here, in terms of consultation. So consultation over any development on Indigenous lands. So Convention 169 is particularly about recognising Indigenous rights to land and waters, and Indigenous rights to be consulted over governance, over industrial development that might impact on their lands.
So has there been a real change in how the government is viewed by locals? Because it seems like under the dictatorship there was a very sort of neoliberal approach. It was for the mining.
Chile is the neoliberal miracle, of course, and the water law and the mining law were a huge part of that miracle, because what they did is they opened it up for especially this region 2 of Chile, the Antofagasta region, which is incredibly rich in copper, especially, and other minerals. It was opened up for extraction and exploitation by the neoliberal policies of the Pinochet regime. Guided by the Chicago Boys. Right? So,
Chicago Boys?
The Chicago Boys being a group of economists educated in Chicago in neoliberal principles, who then used Chile as a testing zone, as a testing ground for neoliberal political economic policies.
In the 1970s, 80s?
In the early 1970s, from the early 1970s, but it really gained ground in the early 1980s, so bit by bit. Yeah.
So how, in your work here with locals, in Atacamanians, in Pene, how do they see the state? Because previously, all about, opening up for mining, for economic development. Now, with the introduction of an Indigenous law, with Convention 169, more recognition of them and their rights.
Yeah, so that's right. But the thing about this region 2 of Chile, so we're in the far north, we're a long way from the state. We're a long way from the central state. And there's a lot about that distance that continues, despite the fact that there are new laws that recognise Indigenous rights, and the government has moved to also put in place environmental laws and so on to kind of more highly regulate the industrial development, we'll say mining development. However, so you have a kind of, you have an absolutely present state in many ways, because the state enables mining in so many ways, and so it's absolutely present in that way. But in terms of infrastructure, in terms of many of the things that a state would do close to the city, you know, there's the infrastructure, infrastructure, health, education, and so on. The state is quite absent. So you have local authorities, the municipality, who are involved to some extent, but there is a lot of autonomy for people here in Peine, which is both a good thing and a bad thing. So a good thing because people run, there are about 10 different organisations in this town of maybe 300 or 400 people. They have a water committee that looks after the water infrastructure. They have an electricity committee that looks after the infrastructure of electricity and makes sure that everybody pays for their lights. They have a committee that is the Comunidad Indígena, the Indigenous Community Directorate. They have a Junta de Vecinos, which is the which you could say it's sort of like a small municipality, like a small local council, and then the Comunidad Indígena is more about territorial rights, and that started with the Indigenous law. And then you have a whole bunch of other committees that also look after local issues. You have sports clubs, you have the Mothers Club, you have parents clubs from the school, and so it's almost like you have a small state inside the town, and they do operate quite autonomously. And that is both to their advantage and their disadvantage, especially when it comes to then negotiating with mining companies about territorial and water rights.
Is part of that working together part of socios that you've written about? Part of working together in a communal way?
Yeah, I guess I understand this area of Chile to be also part of a sort of broader Andean tradition where labour and communal labour is part of what it is to be a person in society, that communal labour makes you a proper person. So people now say, well, you know, things have changed, you know, since everybody has jobs in the mines. It means that life is more complicated and not everybody participates like they used to. So, but still people participate in communal work. So I've participated in communal work while I've been here as well, to clean the streets before a religious festival. And to do that, people have, you know, get together in the morning. A roll is called of all of the socios, that is adult responsible members of the community. A roll is called if there is a representative of each house you know, throughout the, and if there's a representative there, and if there's no representative present, then they pay a fine. So communal work like that. But then there's also the idea of communal work for agricultural practice as well, and some of that it means, you know, joining in and giving a hand. So to be a socios is to be a responsible adult member of the community, and that means picking up your end of work and taking part in things.
Has mining certainly impacted the way socios operates as a system?
Time has impacted that, and mining is part of that time. So mining, the smaller of the lithium mines here on the Salar, started up in the late 1970s, and people immediately looked for work there and got work there. And that brought a new kind of wealth, a cash wealth, to this town. And as I said, cash complicates what was a trading and agricultural life. It also makes it better. People talk about life being better. but it complicates it. It complicates the ability to which people can lend a hand in communal work. So mining, yeah, and now almost everybody has somebody in the family who works in mining.
Now you mentioned water and mining can't be separated, and I think one of those water stories is quite important here in terms of how water came to Peene, in terms of how they opened up another spring to deliver water. Can you just tell us that story?
For me, in my interpretation, the story of going to get a new source of potable water here in a place called Chaquisoque is a story about a kind of a local form of kind of new modernity. It was sort of, they found that the water that comes from the spring and that feeds their agricultural land here, for a while they knew that it was really full of minerals, and it would, when you used it to make powdered milk, it would separate, and it wouldn't cook the potatoes or the lentils or the beans very well, and they did tests and it was just too full of minerals. So they decided to go and find a new source of water, and they worked, Don Vicente, who went with us in the last couple of days, he followed, they knew that there was this source up at Chaquisoque, and so what they did is they made this path that you can see sort of here. They made it up through the mountains bit by bit, so that they could then have somewhere to lay the pipes back down from that new source of water. So in order to do that, they organised work parties of 30 days, of sort of 10 days, but, you know, sort of 3, and they organised these work parties with the socios of the community. So all the adult members of the community were expected to work their share, and working meant that you then had rights to the water infrastructure when it reached town. So, I mean, this is 45 kilometres straight up into the mountains, and Chaquisoque sits at over 4,000 metres above sea level. And so, and this rocky ground, I mean, there are some seriously impressive kind of elements of this work, of this communal work. That communal work produced tensions as well, because some people didn't work and some people did. Some people weren't able to work because they were were earning a salary, they were employed elsewhere, and so they paid a fine, and so that also helped the process. And then some people didn't partake at all. So when the water arrived in town, and it was and the last little bit, they reached a certain point, and the money that they had raised to do this themselves ran out. And that last little bit, they were helped by a number of mining companies and also the municipality, the authorities, who then were very pleased with themselves and cut the ribbon and said how much they'd helped Peene. But when then the water came to the town, the authorities insisted on connecting everybody to this water infrastructure, which caused some tensions among people, seeing as part of the deal in the communal work was that those who worked, or those who recognised the work of others by paying the fine, were entitled to water. And so that's been a little bit of a tension for as long as I've been listening to people in community meetings, and also interviewing people about water. Yeah, they've recently started to deal with that tension by charging people a small fee for the water consumption from their taps in their houses, and over a certain amount of consumption, then they get a fine. So there's a slow kind of process of different kinds of work, I guess, of recognizing different kinds of work, and recognizing different kinds of water, and recognizing different kinds of value. The labour value of water, the economic value of water, and then this recent kind of charging people for the water in their taps, which is not to make a profit, for the community or to make a profit for the water committee, but it's just to maintain the water system. And that's how it's explained to me. It's not simply an economic value. It's both a value that comes from the labour that originally happened, and also to recognise the fact that keeping up water infrastructure is expensive. So it's a maintenance type value as well.
But water in general here isn't just seen as a resource that everybody needs on a daily basis, or that a mining company might need for use in their mining operations. Water here is also constructed or thought of as something more. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
People talk about water also as being a being. So, and their practices around water also speak to that understanding. So of course people understand that water has its economic value. They've lived in Chile since the water code. They know that the water rights have an economic value for the government and for the mining companies. But locally there's also an understanding of water as part of nature, which is a being, which is part of the broader kind of being that includes humans as well. And so you can see that in local practices. So there are a few different kind of rituals and ceremonies where you can see this idea of water as a being. And one of them is a pago ritual where that happens at different times. For example, in Chaquisoque, where they brought the new source of water last year, I took part in a ritual where the little reservoir from that keeps the water, where the water goes after it comes out of the spring, that they've constructed in order to then pipe it down to the village, that was cleaned out and a new concrete top was put on. But no labour like that happens without a small ceremony that goes with water. And so there was also a pago ritual which involved spilling alcohol on the ground, and also drinking some yourself, having something to eat and also putting some in the ground, chewing coca leaf and also putting some on the ground. And I won't explain much more of the detail of it, but also the annual ceremonies that are agricultural ceremonies that happen in October.
When you mentioned pago ritual, pago means to pay.
Mm-hmm.
It reflects back to the economic value in a way. Is that related, or is it what's the paying for? What's
the payment, the transaction is it's almost like mollification. It's like pacification. It's like a pacification of the Pachamama, the earth mother, the earth being, that is water, that is the cerros, the mountains, that is nature. So it's like a pacifying payment. And some of the things that people say when they spill a little bit of alcohol on the ground, which happens daily. You're not supposed to drink a beer without spilling some on the ground as well for the Pachamama, or even any liquid. Actually, some people take it very seriously, and soft drink too. They might spill a bit on the ground before they drink.
And you spill with the right hand for
the Pachamama, and then some people also spill with the left hand for the ancestors, for people who've gone before. The idea of pacification, and people say things like that it will rain, and that you will continue, that the waters will continue to flow.
All right. Now, Sally, you've worked with Indigenous people in Australia previously, and now you're working with Indigenous people here. Is there a big difference between what indigeneity means in Australia vis-a-vis Chile?
I think you can take it at the macro level and just say, well, no, absolutely not. The original people from here. But of course, then you have to think about what is originality. What's the time depth? Where do you take originality to? So here, for example, the people here in Peine in the past lived in a much bigger territory. Peine wasn't a whole village of people. They moved throughout this larger territory with animals in the highlands, during the summer months and in the lowlands on the Salar in the winter months, and passing over into Argentina. So and so people here talk about some of the families have more Argentinian roots, but there are Argentinian roots also of probably original peoples there. So the indigeneity is recognized by the state, for example, as the Chilean state recognized indigeneity in 1993 with the indigenous law. And they recognized Atacameños as a particular group of indigenous people in the Atacama, in this region. So people from Peine, who say, you know, who are families from here, are recognized as indigenous people under that law, and are recognized as Atacameños.
Is there a definition beyond the legal that you work with?
No. Sorry. I didn't say. I mean, Atacameños is a name that is recognized by the state, but then there's also a kind of autochthonous name that is that people talk about being Licanantay, and so which is a Kunsa term, and Kunsa is the original language from here, not Spanish. The conquistadors brought Spanish, and probably before people spoke a little bit of whatever of the language that Inca, because the Inca road comes through here, and so they probably spoke a bit of that before as well, and probably left some roots, some Incan roots through this area. They certainly left structures, the Inca kingdom, but Licanantay and Kunsa are the sort of original languages. Licanantay refers to Atacameño people. Not everybody uses Licanantay. Across further towards Calama, in another part of this region, indigenous people there use that term more than self-identifying as Atacameños. People here identify, I guess, as Atacameños, certainly. But then there are also those older people who say that they were just from here before, you know, they didn't identify as indigenous. In fact, one old man told me once that he said, you know, we're not, indigenous. What is that? We're not Indians. We're not primitives. So there are negative connotations to the word indigenous, or Indian, and there remains some prejudice and some racism towards people, and the word indigena can sometimes be taken a little bit. Indigenous, indigena, can sometimes be taken a little bit like the word India, and both of them are pejorative. So identifying as being from here is kind of the working definition of indigenous. Yeah.
But it brings out nicely the sort of self-identifying and an identification presented to people by the state or by a legal construct.
And not just presented to people, but also people start with the indigenous law and with the process of recognition. That also meant that I guess politicians, local politicians, people from here who have a kind of political mind, started reading about what it was to be indigenous as well, and identified with that, and have also identified with the discourse, the global discourse of indigeneity. I see that happening, especially in negotiations with authorities, with state authorities, and also in my observations of their negotiations with the state. So there is somewhat of that kind of global discourse here of indigeneity as well, of course, because it has power in negotiations. So.
In terms of global discourse and global companies, as an Australian anthropologist from a university, working in a setting such as this, were there problems or challenges, and obviously also lots of opportunities, particular to your position as an outsider, but also as an Australian? There are Australian companies, mining companies operating here, coming into a small, closely knit community.
Well, I came here to Peine because I read about it when I first came to the region and started reading about all different kinds of things going on in the region. I read about Peine and also people in San Pedro de Atacama, in the tourist town further to the north here, talked about Peine as being just surrounded by mines. And in particular, people talked about this agreement, this legal agreement they had with the copper mine, Minera Escondida, which was one of the first legal agreements in this whole region between an indigenous community and a mining company. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. I looked into who Minera Escondida are, and they're owned by BHP Billiton, which are a majority Australian company. So when I came here and started talking to people as an independent researcher from a university, interested in that relationship between the company and the community, and interested in both sides, so interested in talking to the company as well as talking to the community members and taking part in life here, and doing participant observation here. Most people at the very beginning just assumed that I worked here in Peine, assumed that I worked for the mining company because I'm Australian and because they're an Australian company, and were concerned about about that. And so one man who's a consistent member of the community leadership group challenged me to produce a document that would prove that I was an independent researcher. So challenged me to produce a document that said, yes, I was employed by the University of Queensland, and that I wasn't operating with any funds from the mining company. And he was concerned about that because I was talking to people about their perceptions of environmental impact. I was talking to people about perceptions of their relationships with the mining company, and he was concerned that that would then put people here in a difficult position.
And in Australia, certainly a lot of anthropologists are employed by mining companies for exactly these reasons, to work within a community and community relations. Did mining companies approach you for your expertise?
Well, it's interesting that Australia is well known in the mining industry, and outside of that, as a place where there is a decent kind of depth of history of anthropologists and mining companies and the state and Indigenous people working around these issues. And so the mining company, when I approached them for interviews, and also when I took part and observed in meetings between them and community members here, have always approached me to ask me to help inform them of my reflections on the process in order for them to improve their relations with the community, and once or twice have offered work to do that more officially. But that's not something that I'm interested in doing. I think I'm interested in being an independent researcher. I'm employed by the university, and I think it compromises independence to accept that kind of work in the kind of position that I'm in.
In most of the interviews, we've actually asked anthropologists about what do you consider the mission of anthropology to be? And this question sort of relates to that a little bit. What do you consider the mission of anthropology to be?
Well, there's the immediacy. I mean, we're here in the place where I do fieldwork. There's the immediacy of being a witness to processes. So observing meetings and so on is useful to create accounts of the world, of what's going on in the world. But more than that, to start to think about ways in which what's going on in particular places is also going on in other parts of the world, and to think about, I guess, global themes, to think about how these things can be compared across the world. The mission of anthropology.
But I think these global themes are really important, because one thing anthropology does is connect often minute detail from one locality with another locality, and can do comparisons, but also show connections between places and people who otherwise would never be connected. And I think that's an important contribution in terms of, it could be a struggle, it could be something great that they've done that could be replicated elsewhere, or it could just be knowing that other people in a similar position and learning from whatever people are doing to overcome or work within certain scenarios.
No, I guess that's what I was trying to say is both to connect the minute and particular to the global in terms of the human issues of our time. You know, that's what we do.
Having worked in the Atacama Desert for quite a while now, what's been the most enjoyable thing about this glorious place as a field site, and what have been some of the challenges that you've faced here?
Well, I haven't really worked here for that long. It's only been 5 years. Not a very long time in this place. But the most enjoyable was the thing that when I first came to visit here, made me stay here. And I met some of the most lovely people. The people that I work with here, I've just enjoyed incredibly working with them. And that's one of the best things about anthropology, is being with people. Incredibly generous, and I'm privileged to have been able to continue working here. The most difficult thing, probably when I first came here, was the fact that it was out of contact. So there wasn't the telephone antenna down there that we have now, and so it was very difficult. There's one bus that comes in at night, and it goes at 6 o'clock in the morning, comes in around 10, and it goes at 6 o'clock in the morning, and just being such a long way away was the most. I think anthropologists who work in remote places find that it's not so remote anymore. The antenna has made it closer to everything.